Hello and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I am delighted to be joined by Kimberly Brock, author of the novel The Fabled Earth. Kimberly, hi.
Hi.
So we're talking about The Fabled Earth, which is about an island in, is it Georgia?
Yes.
Called Cumberland Island. I'm from Minnesota. We have a lot of lakes. We don't have a lot of islands. Tell me about what is Cumberland Island and why did you choose this setting for your novel?
So Cumberland Island is an 18-mile island that's off the coast of Georgia, which we call the Golden Islands. It is mostly still undeveloped, and it's been one of those places where sort of our American history began as America, and it's been a contentious spot for centuries. People have battled over it. People who were indigenous, and then the French and the Spanish and the British, and it's been involved in a long, long history. And I grew up in North Georgia, but my first trip to the beach was to St. Simon's Island, which is down near Cumberland on our coast here in Georgia. And so I've always had this fascination. I remember my first historical fictions that I read as a girl, probably in the eighth grade, were written by a woman named Eugenia Price. And she wrote all about the Georgia coast. So my early historical fiction, I guess my first experiences were about that place. And I loved it. I loved going and visiting the cemeteries there and seeing where the families were buried that I had been reading about. I loved all of the mystery of this place with the live oaks and all of the moss and the idea that so many centuries of people and so many stories had passed through this place. And islands do something that I find intriguing just as a natural landscape, and that they sort of roll over and change, and so they remain, but they're always changing. And to me, that metaphor is just rich for stories. Cumberland Island, I should also say, is really intriguing because the Carnegie family um, came and built summer homes. One of the brothers, there were two brothers, Andrew and Thomas. And Thomas and his wife built these beautiful, grand, Gilded Age mansions. And they are still there. And it's a spooky landscape to begin with, and it's a spooky scene to see these houses look like they've been dropped there out of nowhere. They don't look like they belong, and so that really inspired the idea of a Southern historical fiction for me.
And well, the mansion, what's the name of the mansion featured in the novel? The Dungeness, is that what it's called?
Dungeness Mansion, yes.
Dungeness.
So there are several of these houses that are still standing, and several of them feature in the novel. The main one is Dungeness Mansion. It burned in 1959. They think it was arson, but it's still a mystery. The ruins are there, so yeah, it's just rife for making stuff up and inspiring writers like me. We went and visited Cumberland for our 25th wedding anniversary, and so I got to see it. And that was it. I was off and running.
So tell me a little bit about from that moment of inspiration, how you developed a narrative around this setting. Of course, you created this character, Cleo Woodbine. You had to learn the history about the Carnegies there. So how did that all come together for you?
So weirdly, if I roll this back, during COVID, my family and I decided we needed to get out of our house with our kids. And we rented a house up in the mountains here in North Georgia. And I was starting to think about what I wanted to write after the Lost Book of Eleanor Dare, which was kind of hard to follow up. I'd spent a lot of years working on that book. And so I wanted space and time to just sit and think. And I had a little screen porch, and I was sitting there. We were looking out over the Chattahoochee River. And I love the idea of how stories travel over centuries and across seas. And I am particularly very interested in how folk tales have traveled from the British Islands to the southern United States. And so I'm sitting there and I'm looking at that river, and there's a legend in North Carolina on the river, French Broad River, of a water siren named the Lorelei. And it actually comes from Germany. And so I was sitting there thinking about that, and I thought, well, maybe I'll write something about a siren. And I started looking up mythology about sea serpents. Well, we also have a sea serpent myth on the coast of Georgia, very near to where I set this novel. And I thought, isn't isn't that intriguing? The idea that your stories cross time and space, and I like linking both sides of my state, the mountains where I grew up and the coast, and that idea linked those two things. So then we took that trip to Cumberland, and I'm standing there looking at Dungeness, and I think all of our stories are ghost stories because they're our stories. They come, I think, from something beyond us in some way, in a mystical way. They are what make up humanity. And so I'm looking at that ruin, and I thought, what if your stories literally haunted you? And that's where Cleo Woodbine came from. So you can see it's this winding, strange tale. And that's sort of what the whole book turned into, the idea of this girl whose grandfather fills her head with these folk tales that he's brought from Scotland. And now, as a young woman who's faced this tragic event in her life, those folk tales, the characters from those folk tales, are following her and keep her company. So, and that idea, I think, I hope, translates to each of the three women in this book in some way. That your stories trail along behind you, and you have to make peace with them.
So you've got folklore and legend. You also have a dual timeline set in 1932 and 1959.
Yeah, see, I can't do anything simply, right?
Yeah. And then of course there's the place is kind of a character in and of itself. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of winding all those different aspects together?
I think it's more challenging when I try and talk about it than when I write it. And I hope it's not that challenging when you read it. Um, I sort of I just had a conversation with my literary agent, and she said, it's really interesting seeing your process because you kind of do everything backward, which is true. I sort of start with my endings, and I start with the very internal things about my characters, and then I back out from that. And I I relate very early on with landscape that I'm in my setting. So I don't think it's complicated in my mind because it seems like I start with a kernel the same way some people start with a question. I kind of tend to start with a place, and then the characters and the plot evolve out of that rather than the other way around. Does that answer your question?
I mean, I think, like you said, it would kind of be impossible to get into your head and to figure out the craft of all of it. And I know there's a lot of work that goes in behind the scenes. But yeah, that definitely gives me an idea of how it starts to come together.
So the fire that burned Dungeness is sort of the culmination, I guess, of this novel. And it's still a question. Like I said, what it's a mystery. What actually happened there? There's a lot of theories, and I'm, most people are very certain that it has to do with territory. That the Carnegie family owned the majority of the island at the time, because this is set in 1959. And there were many people who grew up around those islands and people who visited who liked to sneak on the island and hunt or just goof off, right? And the Carnegies were trying to protect their home and this place that they loved. And so there was a lot of contention between these factions. And there are recorded, documented events that took place where there were violent encounters. People brought their shotguns out, people were run off the island, people were shot, boats were burned. And so they think that one of these poachers, or a group of them, set fire to Dungeness. And I thought about the history, just the societal changes at the end of the 1950s, and what that landscape would have been like, and layered that on top of the natural landscape. And then you have these people who have come from, I mean, I'm Scotch Irish through and through. We don't want neighbors, right? And we have people who have come from Pittsburgh with all their money and built these huge homes and said, now it's ours. And that is so human and so contemporary, even if I'm writing about historicals. And so those layers of thought went into this. People are just people. They're always going to be people. We're always trying to establish home. Who does this belong to? When you stand on this little hill, is it yours? Can you call it yours? Who was here before? Who are you building on top of? All of those ideas went into the idea of this novel. And that big fire at the end for Dungeness to burn, it was sort of the mother house of all of the houses. It was this big, gorgeous home that they had built. And so strange where it sits. They had everything had to be brought in by boat, ice, food, everything. So the amount of money to keep the thing up was incredible. And it was already sitting empty in 1959. So it was just right for something like this to happen. And it's such a beautiful picture of how we struggle and what's left in the end.
Definitely a lot of very relevant topics. I'm curious, is the island still privately owned?
So the island is now a national park, and you can visit. You can only get there by ferry. There are people who do still live on the island. Grayfield Inn is the only place you can stay as a hotel now. There have been hotels that came and went over the years. There were little railroads and things. All of that is gone at this point. But Grayfield is where my husband and I stayed, and it is run by descendants of the Carnegies who built all of the houses. And it is charming. It's a big, beautiful old Southern home. And the national park runs tours over the island. They limit how many people can be on the island. You can camp on the island. And when I wrote this book, I was so torn. I was like, oh, I want people to know about this beautiful place. Oh, I don't want anybody to know about this beautiful place. Please protect this beautiful place. Don't go, don't go. And yet I'm saying, here's this beautiful place. So I know people will be intrigued like I was. But I also think when you step foot in this place, because it has been preserved very well, and it is contentious. They still fight over how best to do that, and who is in charge of doing that, and whether the national park is doing a good job or not. And everybody's got their opinions. But I hope that if people visit after they read the book, they feel like I did. It feels like a gift because there are these undeveloped beaches that just stretch for miles and these beautiful trees. It doesn't even seem real. And so you feel a responsibility to take care while you're there.
Well, I definitely want to visit. Like I said, I hadn't heard of the place, but I've been to dozens of national parks, so I'll add that one to my list.
It's amazing. It really is. It feels like you are outside of time. I've been a lot of places. It's one of those places where you leave and you feel like you dreamed it. It doesn't seem real at all. And at the same time, I cannot imagine living the way that the Carnegie family lived during that time. It was such a outside of reality experience, I'm sure. And to have that amount of wealth and no rules, it's all yours, right? So the people that visited over the years, and the strange stories and all of the bizarre history, and let's build a golf course, let's have an airstrip, let's it was just this playground of that gilded age. So it's a very cool history. It's very odd, and the people are odd. I could not mind. I mean, I read so many books. I read so many stories, and every story I'm like, "Oh, that's the best. That's going in the book." And then by the time I'm actually writing the novel, a lot of that had to be left out. That's all I would do. Would just be telling the stories that I had learned of the true history of the island.
Well, I do want to get a little bit more into the narrative, into the novel. We've mentioned Cleo Woodbine. Who are the other two protagonists you use to tell the story? What are they all about?
Yeah. So Cleo has been on this island for decades. She comes in 1932, and there is a tragic event where two boys drown, and a young woman is sent away, sort of in shame from the event. And Cleo is right at the center of that, and a story that she tells, and she sort of orchestrates everything that leads up to this tragedy in a backhanded kind of way. So she's living with a lot of regret. And in 1959, a young man who was there in 1932 and saved Cleo's life returns to visit her. And it sets off these visitations. So Frances Flood is the second young woman in the book. She is the daughter of the girl from the event in 1932 that was sent away, and she's come there to find out what happened to her mom. What is the deal? And she knows about Cleo. Cleo is famous for her watercolor paintings, and she knows about these paintings. So she's interested in how their history is connected. And then the third character is an even younger young woman who is newly wed and then widowed within only a few months, and she has come to run an inn in town that belonged to her deceased aunt. And she takes photographs around town. She has a little brownie camera, and she was a kid in high school just a minute ago, right? So she's come there still a kid, trying to be an adult, grieving this very short marriage, and she's taking photographs. And she takes this photograph, and when it's developed, it's really eerie. It's double exposure, and some people in town think that she has taken a picture of a ghost. And it's a photograph that looks like one of the boys that drowned in 1932. So that story from 1932 brings these three women together and learning each of their own truths from that story in 1959.
I really like the title, The Fabled Earth. Was that something you knew right away? Was it something that was suggested to you? How did you determine the title?
Titles are hard for me. They're so hard for me. I went around and around and around for this title. We had to search for it. I knew that everything about this book for me was about what a, a fable is, or a myth, and why. We don't want the truth. We want a myth because we want a story that symbolizes us, that symbolizes our mysteries, our stories, our emotions. And I wanted somehow to capture that, but I also knew this book was very much about the landscape, the all of the landscape, the human landscape, the natural landscape. And so those two ideas came together for me for this title.
Let's talk a little bit about your background. You have a background as an actor. I just had a panel the other day. One of the writers was also an actor, and she said she was really able to use that in order to tell better characters, more immersive characters. Do you do the same thing with your acting background?
I do. I do. I like to, I mean, I see it in my head when I write. It's definitely I'm watching a play in my head. I'm watching it play out. And then as I draft, I read it aloud. Um, Dialogue is a thing. I love language, but yeah, the acting background is there, and I think that's that visual component of it in my mind anyway. I can see it playing out. So yeah, I think so. And the idea of how a story of the effect, the emotional effect of it as it's rolling along, where I need those beats and where there needs to be quiet or where there needs to be something that pulls at the reader. I, yeah, absolutely. It comes from that, mostly from stage. Yeah.
And you also started a writing workshop, the Tinderbox Writers Workshop. Tell us about what that is and why you started it and how it's going.
So I started that, gosh, how many years ago? Many years ago. While I was in between books. I had written my first book, and if you look at it, you'll see there is a big long gap between 2012 when my first novel, The River Witch, was published by a small press, and then when Eleanor Dare came out a couple of years ago. So I had been writing and raising kids. I have three children, but Eleanor Dare was it was hard. It was hard. I tried writing it three different ways before I actually had the novel that I wanted to write. And during that time, there was a period where I was just stuck. And it wasn't because I didn't know what I wanted to write, I just didn't know how I wanted to pull it off. And I thought, well, I can create space for creatives. I may not know much, but I know how to do that. To sit down in a room and say, okay, let's talk and let's make something. And I was a teacher before I had my own children. I taught kids with behavior disorders, severe behavior disorders, and learning differences. And I'm a little eccentric, and I like for it to be a little off the beaten path. So I found a place where I could sit down, and I put out an ad and said, anybody who feels like they've just sort of lost their creativity and they want to do something, come sit with me. And so it started as that, and then it turned into some writing workshops. And I think, the creative aspect of it, and being a teacher, being an actor, being a reader, being a writer, all those things came together for these workshops, predominantly women. And then they turned into retreats. So I had a friend who was like, oh, I have this place. Would you like to come do some retreats here? So we started doing those a couple of times a year. And now mostly I teach them just when I'm invited to come speak because I'm writing again on my own work. But it was amazing. People made quilts, they made cookbooks. It wasn't just writing, but it was all creativity. It was all realizing we can use our hands. We can use so many different ways to express story. So that's what that was and is.
And does the workshop continue to grow? Is it
I have not done a workshop, and my friend moved, so I lost my space to do the retreats. But I'm
okay?
kind of hoping to revive that maybe in the next year. Now and COVID too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, you talked a little bit about your journey from your debut to The Lost Book of Eleanor Dare. Now you have The Fabled Earth. You've achieved, what I would call a successful as being as an author, but where do you feel you're at, and what are some of your challenges moving forward in your career as an author?
Ooh, you saved the hard ones for last, right? Where do I feel I'm at? I feel so lucky. I feel so lucky. I know so many writers, better writers than I am. I think it's just luck of the draw sometimes that your story lands in a place where somebody is ready for it, or it just speaks to them for some reason, and you have so little to do with that. I feel like bringing a book, I've always been a writer. If you tell stories, if you sit down and scribble words, you're a writer. But being an author means being a business person. That's new to me. And I want to please everybody. So that kind of drives me crazy. I feel a lot of stress from that because and maybe that's the Southern thing too. I want everybody to be happy. I struggle there. But I feel so lucky in the business aspect because I don't think as writers we have a lot of control over that. It's just luck that we wind up at the right place in the right time. So right now, I'm at the right place in the right time for somebody to be publishing my books. We'll see what happens with the next one. It always feels like I'm just starting from the very beginning all over again. I have no idea what I'm doing, and I I don't think we do. I think stories are these wild things that are just moving through the world all around us, and you have to catch one. And there's no real way to do that except just to run out and try and grab it, right? There's not like a process that I know. I can make notes, I can scribble ideas, I can come up with topics, right, or things that just intrigue me from research that I run across. I have folders like that. But for to find a whole idea, to catch a story, the whole story, I don't know how you do that except you just sling yourself out there and grab hold of it. So I'm back at the sling and grab stage for the next story. I'm looking for the wild stories. We'll see what I come up with next.
Well, I hope you do catch one. If nothing else, you gave us a great quote to work with there, a great piece of audio from that. Uh, so do you have anything in mind for your next project? Are you leaning towards
Do, but
anything?
Colin, I can't tell you. I'll
Okay.
scare it off. I'll scare it away.
Okay, we don't want to do that.
It's two sisters. It's a little dark. It's another Southern Gothic. So I think it will be set near Asheville, North Carolina this time.
Well, we'll look forward to that one as well. Well, Kimberly, congratulations on the Fabled Earth. Thanks so much for joining me once again for the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. It was great seeing you again, Colin. I appreciate you.